Good afternoon. I am Stephen Nonak, William D. Hacker, Head of Reader Services, and it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. This talk is being taped by WGBH as part of its Network Forum series. The life of Harriet Tubman, Maryland-born slave, Underground Railroad conductor, Civil War spy, abolitionist lecturer, and philanthropist, has been the stuff of legend for years and years. Though scores of books for children have been published, up until last year, the most recent biography of Harriet Tubman for adults was the one published in 1943, and it wasn't very good. All of a sudden, now there are 3 biographies of one of the essential American women of the 19th century. Of the 3 biographies of Tubman, Kate Clifford Larson's Bound for the Promised Land has arguably received and is continuing to receive the most critical praise. And we're keeping our fingers crossed for the major review, which is set to appear in the New York Times on Sunday. Kate Larson, unlike the other 2 writers, scoured the East Coast in pursuit of primary source material, including local public records held in little tiny repositories. This is a solid, well-researched biography that is going to last. Kate conducted much of her research in the secondary sources at the Athenaeum, I am proud to say. Ladies and gentlemen, Kate Clifford Larson.
Thank you, Stephen. That was really nice of you. Thank you all for coming today. It's wonderful to be back here in the Athenaeum. I enjoyed my tenure here as a fellow a few years ago, and actually that was the first fellowship I actually received outside of the university, and it sort of launched me on my way. And the materials housed here are just fabulous, and Stephen is a fabulous librarian, and he helped me very, very much. So I love being back here. Today I'm going to talk about not only Harriet Tubman's life, but the process that I went through to research her life and the information that I dug up that led me to reevaluate what we already know about her. Back in 1993, I returned to Simmons College to get my master's degree in women's history. And I was at the time reading some children's biographies of Harriet Tubman to my daughter, and I became intrigued and interested and wanted to know more about her. So I searched for an adult biography, and the only thing that I could find were 2 biographies written by Sarah Bradford in the 19th century, and they were quite limited and quite inaccurate and in a way very racist. So those were not appropriate readings. And then Earl Conrad's biography, as Stephen mentioned, that was written in 1943, which also was a very limited biography. So I became intrigued why this famous woman had not been treated by scholars in the later 20th century. So I started looking into it, and my advisors at Simmons at the time immediately recognized that the project would be too large to do for a master's thesis. So I worked on another topic and decided to go for my PhD and do my dissertation on Tubman. And early on, I was discouraged by many people who said, "You're never going to find anything. She was a slave. She was illiterate. She didn't leave any of her own documentation behind. You're never going to find enough material to write a dissertation on this woman." But I felt driven, and I fortunately didn't pay attention, and I started my research trail. And surprisingly, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters and diaries and journals and court records all up and down the East Coast, even as far away as California and Canada, that are related to Harriet Tubman. Of course, none of these letters are in Harriet's hands, but many of them were written while Harriet was sitting there with the author of the letters or diaries or journals. And court records and census records, etc., helped fill out more of her life story and that of her family. So one thing led to another, one letter would lead to another letter, one journal would lead to another journal or another diary. And soon, her life story started to emerge. When I traveled down to the eastern shore of Maryland, where Harriet Tubman was born, I learned that the courthouse in Dorchester County, where she had been raised, had burned in 1852, destroying a great majority of the colonial and early 19th century records. So I was a bit discouraged at that point. But come to find out, the clerk of courts had taken home a court record book the night before the fire, or the weekend of the fire, to do some work over the weekend. And it preserved a 5-year history, and in that history was a lot of documentation about Harriet Tubman and her family. It was like a gift from heaven. And that led to discovering more and more documents. And as it turned out, in spite of the Great Fire, many documents had been saved, pulled from the fire while it was occurring. And the whole courthouse had not been destroyed. That in fact, even though they said everything had been ruined, they had not been. And after the fire, the court officials had called upon the community to redeposit many court records, wills and probate records, etc., which many members of the community did do. And again, there were records that dealt with Harriet Tubman. So based on these records and more research in the North, because Harriet Tubman became so close to so many Northern abolitionists, and they were very taken by her and very intrigued by her, and she became very, very close to them. Many of them would write letters back and forth to each other, talking about her, quoting her. And so these were fresh, contemporary sources. Smith College has a great collection of Garrison family papers, and the Garrison women became very close to Tubman. In their daily letters to each other, they would talk about her and her needs and what she was doing and how she felt and her latest escapades, her latest escape and rescue mission. They would talk about these in their letters. So it started to open up this whole new world about Harriet Tubman that had not been explored before. So these are some of the things that I discovered about her. Harriet Tubman was the daughter of Ben Ross and Harriet Ritt was her nickname, Green Ross. They had 9 children. Harriet was the 5th child. They were married about 1808, and their first child actually was born in 1808, Lina. Another daughter was born in 1811, Mariah Riddy, another Soph, then Robert. Then Harriet Tubman was born in probably late February, early March 1822. And we know this because a couple of slave masters were forced to testify at one point in the 1850s about the ownership of Harriet Tubman's family. It's a very complicated story about contesting a will written in the 18th century about ownership of Harriet's mother, and which meant ownership of her children. So fortunately, we have testimony from these masters who say that she was born about 1822. And then in another court case, there was a journal deposited as part of the exhibits to this court case, and there was a record of Harriet Tubman's mother giving birth and the payment to the midwife for that birth, and it was March 15th, 1822. So we assume, and I think correctly, that this is sometime near Harriet Tubman's own birth date. Harriet, of course, did not know when she was born, but people who spoke to her in the North after she fled estimated it was about 1820 or 21. But combining that with the records from Dorchester County and in Maryland, we were able to piece this together. So we are confident that we have this wonderful record. At the time, Harriet's parents were not owned by the same masters. Anthony Thompson was a very wealthy, well-respected white slave owner, and he owned Ben and about 40 other slaves, actually. And Ben was a prized timberman. He oversaw Thompson's timber operations in Dorchester County. And he was the stepfather to Edward Brodess, who actually owned Ritt and her children. Anthony Thompson had married Edward Brodess's mother, and Edward was a young child at the time and became Thompson's stepson. Mary had died, and so Edward inherited all of these slaves. In about 1823 or 24, he moved Rit and her children, and by then there was another brother, Ben, who had been born about 1823 or 24, to Bucktown, which is about 10 miles away from Anthony Thompson's plantation in Dorchester County. And there he settled with his wife, Eliza. And this is why most people believe that Harriet was born in Bucktown, when in fact, actually, she was not. She was born in a different place. That's neither here nor there. This is where she spent part of her childhood. Edward Brodus had far too many slaves to use profitably on his own plantation. He had a small one, about 300 acres, and he had 10 or 11 slaves, and he didn't need them all, particularly small children who could get in the way of their more productive enslaved mother. So he hired Harriet out at a very young age, probably 6 years old, excuse me, to neighboring farmers who are actually quite cruel and negligent. They beat her, they starved her. She had a very, very difficult time, and she would get sick and be sent home to her mother to be nursed back to health. It was a horrible, horrible childhood. Her mother gave birth to 3 more children: Rachel, who was born in 1825, Henry, who was born in 1830, and Moses in 1832. She also was hired out occasionally to neighboring farmers as well, taking her away from her children. And this is there are many tragedies about slavery, but one of them is the separation of mothers from their children. Harriet also talked about an interview that was never published, that's held in a museum in Auburn, New York. She was interviewed by a white woman around 1904. This woman was going to give a speech to a women's club, and she wanted to talk about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, so she interviewed Harriet. And it is one of the most vivid accounts of Tubman's life that I have ever come across. And in this account, she talks about being 5 years old, and her mother had to go to the house to cook for the master. And Harriet had the responsibility of taking care of a younger brother and a baby. And I assume that that was Ben and Rachel. And she was so little that her mother would come home frightened that something would have happened to them, that the baby would have died in Harriet's care. But she was 5 years old. Horrible, horrible way to grow up. When Harriet was about 13 years old, she was hired to a neighboring plantation. And we all know, if any of you have read these children's books, that she was hit on the head as a young teenager that nearly killed her. Well, in this unpublished interview, she describes in vivid detail exactly what happened. She had been hired to a neighboring plantation, and she had been beating flax in the field during the day. And she described that her hair was quite messy, and that she used to, they never had an opportunity to wash their hair. And when she would eat, she would wipe her hands in her hair to wipe the grease from the pork or whatever off. So her hair was quite sticky, and the flax dust stuck to her hair. And the plantation cook came to her and asked her to go to the local store with her, dry goods store, to get items for the kitchen. But Harriet was embarrassed. So she found a shawl to put over her head because she didn't want people to see her with her messy hair. They go to the store, and they run into an overseer who is chasing a young slave man who had run from his assignment in the fields. And he called to Harriet to stop the boy young man from running from the store. And Harriet would not. She stood he ran out, and she stood in the doorway. And the overseer picked up an iron weight from the dry goods store counter and threw it, intending to hit the young slave man, but it hit Harriet in the head with such great force that it drove pieces of that scarf right into her skull. And so she immediately lost consciousness. They carried her to the plantation kitchen, and they sat her upon the seat of the loom. And there she lay for a day and a half, and the master came and forced her back into the fields. And she described the blood and the sweat streaming down her face until she passed out. It took months for her to recover from this injury. But what happened to her, she was left with a series of symptoms that I believe indicates that she ended up with temporal lobe epilepsy. And temporal lobe epilepsy is an epileptic condition that is naturally occurring in some people, a disease that some people get, but also people who have very, very severe head injuries sometimes end up with this particular type of epilepsy. She was often described as falling asleep at a moment's notice, which a lot of people attributed to narcolepsy. But that's only one of the symptoms that she suffered from for her whole life. She would often see bright lights and auras. She would hear music and harps playing. She would hear rushing water, or she would have a sense of fire burning. She would have a sense of déjà vu quite often, or that she was flying above the earth looking down at everybody. And many of these symptoms are symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. But of course, back then they didn't have medication for this sort of thing, and it ironically played a very significant role in her worldview. She was very, very religious, and after this head injury, she became intensely religious. And she believed that God spoke to her in these visions and in these voices that came upon her at a moment's notice. So she did not see it as a handicap, but rather an enhancement of this strong faith that she grew up with. After she recovered from this horrible injury, she was hired out to another slave master by the name of John T. Stewart, who lived in the area of the county near where her father lived, Ben Ross. So she was brought back into her father's world and the world of her other relatives, and it was this social world that was very important to her. And I don't know how many of you have ever been to the eastern shore of Maryland, but it's water defines life there. And in the colonial times, 19th century, the maritime world was the world of Dorchester County. Travel and communication and transporting of goods all occurred through boats. And who manned those boats but African American sailors, free and enslaved. And Tubman's father, who was involved in this timber operation, who was responsible for getting these great, huge, beautiful white oak logs out of the interior of Dorchester County to the water to be shipped to Baltimore, to New England, knew these communication networks. He knew these African American sailors. And he taught Tubman these communication networks that eventually would become crucial to her as she embarked on her own freedom and her quest of freedom for her family and friends. She became very, very strong, and Edward Brodus, her owner, allowed her to hire her time, paying him $60 a year, and whatever she earned beyond that, she saved to buy a pair of oxen so she could maximize her own earning power. I imagine that she was hoping she could buy her own freedom at some point. She married a free black man by the name of John Tubman in 1844. And in the 19th century biographies, Sarah Bradford gives John Tubman a really hard time because eventually he falls in love with another woman. But at the time, I believe that they loved each other very, very much. And it was not an arranged marriage as some people imagine it to be. For a free black man to marry a slave woman had to be a very, very serious decision, because that meant that he really had no legal rights to her as his wife, and he had no legal rights to her children or their children that would be born as a result of their union, because every child born to an enslaved woman was owned by her owner. So John Tubman could not even claim his own children. She continued to work, and they both tried to save money, and as I said, I imagine trying to buy her freedom. In 1847, she started working for Dr. Anthony Thompson, who was the son of Anthony Thompson, who owned Tubman's father. Anthony Thompson had died in 1836, and he left instructions in his will for Harriet's father to be free in 1840, which he was. So he was a free man from 1840 on. In 1849, Edward Brodus died. He had 8 children. Several of them, I think about 6 of them, were actually still minors, and he was deeply, deeply in debt. And the estate needed to sell some slaves to pay off his bills. So Harriet and her siblings, of course, lived in great fear that they would be sold away. On September 17th, 1849, she fled with her brothers Henry and Ben. And this is a very interesting story. Up until a year ago, we had no idea exactly when Harriet ran away. The newspapers from Dorchester County had been missing for 150 years, for the 1840s and 1850s. Some people believed it was a conspiracy, but it wasn't. But anyway, those newspapers were missing. Last February, a house was sold on High Street in Cambridge, Maryland, in Dorchester County. The same family had owned the house for over 200 years, and nothing had been removed from the house. When they sold it, the family had to get rid of everything, and they pulled up dumpsters behind the house and started dumping. And a local man had no qualms about diving into the dumpster. And what did he find but the bound volumes and loose papers from that time period, including the runaway ad for Harriet Tubman. So this was an extraordinary find, and to think that it would be in a landfill right now if it hadn't been for this man who didn't mind jumping into the dumpster. So we have this date, September 17th, 1849. But we also know that they didn't run away completely. They came back out of fear or for whatever reasons. But Harriet knew that she was going to be sold, so she ran away again by herself and successfully made it to Philadelphia. Over the next 11 years, I discovered that she made about 13 trips and rescued about 70 or 80 people and gave instructions to about another 70 or 80 individuals to run away on their own. All of them were family and friends. The great majority, actually practically all of them, came from Dorchester County or Caroline County, the neighboring county there. She didn't bring away strangers. And actually, as I researched this, I began to understand that, of course, it was too risky to bring away strangers. Underground Railroad operators were betrayed often, very often. And what is remarkable about Tubman is that she was never caught. And her associates who helped her along the way to freedom, some of them were caught and betrayed. But somehow she eluded that, and she was not betrayed. There are records that for some reason were never looked at before. There was a man in Philadelphia by the name of William Still, a very famous African-American Underground Railroad operator. And he wrote a book in 1870, which was a compilation of all the stories that he had taken down about these runaways coming through his office. And in that book, he describes the different people who came through, their stories, who their owners were, the names they may have taken on their way to freedom, any little details that he could about their lives. The reason that he had kept these records is in about 1847, 49, his family actually had run away in the early 1800s, and so they lived in fear of being captured as well. But before they had run away, several of his siblings had been sold away, and he had no idea where they were. But he's walking down the street in Philadelphia in the late 1840s, and he runs into a man, and they start talking, and he realizes that it's his long-lost brother Peter that he hasn't seen for 30 years. So that moment made him realize that he had to record the stories of these runaways, so if family came looking for them, they would be able to find them. William Still kept them in journals, and one of those journals still survives today. And he did not transcribe everything from those journals into his book. And in that journal, he describes when Harriet Tubman would come through his office and who she brought with her. So this was another piece of the puzzle, being able to trace when Tubman made these rescue missions, who she brought away, what time of year, and the conditions of the people that came with her. Thomas Garrett was another famous Underground Railroad operator, a Quaker who was living in Wilmington, Delaware, a slave state at the time. And Thomas Garrett wrote many letters, and he wrote about Harriet Tubman coming through his office. And then in the North, many of these abolitionists that came to know Tubman very well also recorded when she would come by with runaway slaves, or she would tell them a story of a recent rescue. So we have this documentation of when she made her attempts, how successful she was, who the people were that she brought away. So this was a great find. And some people have been upset by my challenging the established numbers that she made 19 trips bringing away 300 people. And actually the math is kind of difficult to understand, which means she'd have to bring away 15 people in each trip. And that is almost impossible to do. Some of the trips she only brought one person, 2 people, 3 people. So it's difficult to imagine that in 19 trips she could bring away 15 people successfully and not get caught. In Christmas 1854, she returned to Dorchester County to rescue her brothers, Ben, Henry, and Robert. And when they fled, they came to William Still's office and they changed their names. Ben Ross became James Stewart, Robert Ross became John Stewart, and Henry Ross became William Henry Stewart. And those are the names that they and their families kept for the rest of their lives. And why they took the Stewart name remains a mystery, but there are several possibilities. One is that that's the name that they recognized as their real name and not Ross. The other possibility is that they were honoring white Stewarts in Dorchester County who may have helped them. And I've been in touch with a descendant of the white Stewarts in Dorchester County, and their old tradition is that they helped Harriet Tubman's family run away. But I can't take that at face value. There's no proof to that, so I'm not sure. But they did take the Stewart name. The other reason that's a distinct possibility is that the Stewarts, white Stewarts in Dorchester County, were incredibly powerful and very wealthy. So these young men might have felt by taking this powerful name that they too could be powerful. So those are the 3 options, and I'm not sure if we'll ever really know why they changed their name to that particular name, but they did. In 1857, Tubman returned to Dorchester County to bring away her parents. Her mother had been purchased by her father, who was free, as I had said before. So she was also free. But her father was an Underground Railroad agent, an operator, and he had come under suspicion finally, and he was about to be thrown in jail. There had been a very famous escape of 8 slaves, and they were called the Dover 8. And this Dover 8 group of slaves had run from Dorchester County and arrived in Dover, Delaware, where they were betrayed by a black Underground Railroad operator and a white Underground Railroad operator who had been quite faithful up until this point. But the $3,000 reward for these 8 was too much to resist, when at the time for $400 you could buy a pretty good sized farm. So they were betrayed into the Dover jail, and somehow they broke out and ran to freedom, and it shocked the Eastern Shore. It was all over the newspapers. They couldn't believe that these 8 could get away. Well, soon suspicion came upon Harriet's father, Ben Ross, and another free black man by the name of Sam Green, who actually may have been related to Harriet Tubman. And he was a reverend, he was literate, he was very well known in Dorchester County. Harriet Tubman successfully brought her parents away, but she could not bring Sam Green away, and he was arrested for aiding slaves to run away. But there wasn't enough proof, so they ended up arresting him, convicting him, and putting him in jail for 10 years for owning a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They claimed that it had inspired resistance on the part of slaves, and that it was an incendiary publication. And so he went to the Maryland State Penitentiary for owning that copy. Harriet Tubman continued to return to the Eastern Shore because she had one sister left that she was trying to retrieve. As a child, 3 of her sisters had been sold. Lina, Soph, and Mariah Riddy had all been sold away to the Deep South, we suspect. And the transactions were probably illegal. And the records of those transactions have not been found yet. But we do know from court testimony that they were sold. But she had one sister left, Rachel. And I believe that the reason she kept returning to the Eastern Shore was to get Rachel and Rachel's 2 children, Ben and Angerine. I believe that if she had been able to get Rachel early on, she never would have returned time and time again. It was so risky, especially after 1857. So she returned again, and in 1860, in November, she arrived on the Eastern Shore to bring Rachel away. And in the meantime, all along, Rachel had been unable to go because she was separated from her children, and she would not leave them. So every time Harriet arrived and Rachel would not leave, she would take another group of friends and go north with them. But in November of 1860, she arrived and discovered that Rachel had died, and she could not retrieve the two children. They were too far away, and she needed $30 to bribe somebody to bring them to her. So she brought away another family that was ready and able to go, and that was Stephen and Maria Enols and their 3 children, and another man by the name of John. And they traveled north, and it was freezing cold. There was rain and snow. It was a very difficult trip. They arrived in Auburn, New York at Christmas, and the day after Christmas, Martha Coffin Wright sat down and wrote a letter to her daughter and described this rescue, about how Harriet had them hiding in woods and swamps. She sang songs to them to keep them calm, to warn them of danger, to tell them that it was okay to come out, that they had a small little blanket to rest on, that they had a tiny bit of food, but they were very hungry, and that they froze throughout this trip. In fact, Harriet, I believe, suffered from frostbite from this trip because she had to spend a couple of weeks with Garrett Smith, another famous abolitionist, to recuperate because her feet were so badly damaged from the cold. And this was her last trip. She could not retrieve her sister, and there was probably great sorrow in her family, in her household. In the meantime, Harriet had met John Brown, the famous abolitionist freedom fighter, in Canada in 1858, and he was so overcome by her personality that he called her General Tubman, and he referred to her as a man. And I don't think that was meant as a sort of a unkind compliment. Her great skill, her great courage was only something that he could identify with men and not with women. But she possessed these qualities that he admired in men, so he called her General Tubman and referred to her as a man. She recruited slaves from Dorchester County. There are about 6 or 7 of them that are documented that haven't been researched before, but Thomas Eliot, Denwood Hughes, Joe and Bill Bailey, Peter Pennington, these were all friends of hers that she had brought north, and they joined John Brown for his planned raid in Harper's Ferry. They eventually did not participate in the raid. Perhaps they realized that it was, too risky, or they got too involved in trying to support themselves and their families, and they did not join John Brown. But it's an exciting piece of history because John Brown really depended on Harriet Tubman and her connections in the Canadian fugitive community to spread the word that he was going to do this and to recruit soldiers for him. She became very active in the Boston area, lecturing on the abolitionist circuit, and she became quite close to many Boston abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, Lewis Hayden, John S. Rock. Franklin Sanborn from Concord wrote the first biography of Harriet Tubman. It was published in the Commonwealth newspaper in 1863, and they became lifelong friends. And they all marveled at her, that she was just so captivating, and she was such a genius, and the way she talked just mesmerized them. And a lot of people just couldn't understand why they were so drawn to her, but they were. They just could not get enough of her. So these letters that they write about her are so rich with stories about her life. And interestingly, in 1859, there were probably 5 or 6 different sources, letters and newspaper accounts that quote her lecturing to crowds, and in these lectures she would say that she had returned 8 or 9 times and rescued 50 or 60 people. So even in Tubman's own words, she knew that she was trying to keep somewhat of a log of who she had rescued and how many there were. She was, of course, a spy during the Civil War and very successful at it. And after the Civil War, she became an active suffragist. And she settled in Auburn, New York, where William H. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, had sold her a farm. And she brought her family there from Canada to live with her. And she struggled for the rest of her life. She experienced extreme poverty trying to support her household, which often included homeless people who would come to find shelter, orphan children. She took in many, many children. So her house was open to everybody, and she struggled financially till the day that she died. She was very active in the suffrage movement, in fighting for civil rights for African Americans, just for equality and justice throughout her life. And so from the day that she was old enough to be cognizant of it, she was a freedom fighter, and this lasted her whole lifetime. And that's what makes her, I think, an American hero. That's why I think even through children's books, she has sort of captivated all of us all these years, because she exemplifies what we imagine to be an American hero, a fighter for liberty, equality, justice, and she never stopped. She never rested until she died in March of 1913. So here is an example of a woman who had very many flaws too, but she was just determined to protect her family and her community of friends and provide a better life for them. And it's really a story about family and community. It isn't about necessarily someone who just had this tremendous humanitarian streak who returned to dangerous slave territory over and over again to bring out nameless, faceless, unknown people. These were her friends and her family. And interestingly, there were other people who did return to bring away family, other fugitive slaves who returned to bring away family members. But as of yet, I have not found anyone who did it as often as Harriet Tubman did. So she risked her life every single time she returned there. There's no doubt that they would have probably lynched her or killed her in some other way or sold her to the Deep South if they had caught her. The issue of the $40,000 reward, which some of you may have read in some of these children's books, that never existed. That was fake. That was created by an abolitionist writer after the Civil War. She kind of made that number up. We have not found a specific reward for her during the 1850s, and according to my research, I do not think that the slaveholders on the Eastern Shore knew that it was Harriet Tubman. First of all, they didn't know her by that name, and also in the world that they lived in, I know that they could not have imagined that this petite 5-foot little slave could have been doing all those rescues. I just know that they could not have imagined that. So that if they understood that it was a Moses, they imagined a man. And they write about in the newspapers that they are upset because they know that there are abolitionist emissaries infiltrating their community. And at first they thought it was a white person, and then they thought it was a black person, but they didn't know who it was. So she was very, very well protected and very secretive. So this is her story. This is the story of researching her life and finding all these wonderful gems about her. And I hope you all read the book and enjoy it and learn more about this remarkable woman who was very real and had a real family and a real life, real emotions, and that she's a great American hero. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
When they escaped, how did they go, by walking?
She took several routes. She did travel by water to Baltimore, and one time she took a trip. She went south in a boat and up to Seaford, Delaware, and then took a train north. Most of her trips were through Caroline County into Delaware, up to Wilmington, and then Philadelphia. Once they reached Philadelphia, they took trains all the way to Canada. But she actually did not live in Canada herself until about 1856. She stayed in Philadelphia. She would bring her charges to Canada and then return to Philadelphia, where she had an apartment. She was also taking responsibility for a young nephew by the name of James Bowley. James Bowley was the son of her niece, Keziah Bowley, who was the first woman that Harriet rescued. And James, she enrolled James in school in Philadelphia and worked to pay his room and board. He went on to become one of the first black legislators in South Carolina after the Civil War, and he was the editor of a black newspaper down there. And he was very proud of his aunt, and he wrote letters about how she had saved him. She rescued him as a young child as well, and how she had worked to support him and put him through school. So anyway, she stayed in Philadelphia until at least 1856, while everybody moved to Canada.
Kate, remind us why she transported people.
Oh, right. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which required Northerners to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Before, there was no punitive action. There was no reason for Northerners to do that. But after 1850, sheriffs and government officials were required to return them. So fugitives were no longer safe living in northern cities. So there was a great migration to Canada at the time. Yes? John Tubman was killed in 1867. When Harriet Tubman left in 1849, he took up with another woman, Caroline, and he married her, and they ended up having 4 children. But he was killed by a white man in 1867 on the side of a road. So in 1869, Tubman was free to marry Nelson Davis, who was a soldier from the Civil War, and he was about 22 years younger than she was. Yes. She ostensibly went down there to do spy work. Governor John Andrew talked with her apparently, and they discussed this, and so she went down, but also to go down and help with the many slaves who were fleeing the plantations in the Port Royal district at Hilton Head in South Carolina. It was one of the first places occupied by Union forces, and Bostonians marshaled together immediately and organized these Freedmen's Aid Societies, and they went down there very quickly in 1862 to set up facilities to provide for these runaway slaves and also to provide for Union soldiers. So Tubman went with this crowd, and she served as a nurse, and she became adept at getting information from the local slave population. And she was paid by the government. She was given $200 spy pay at the time. And she used some of that money to pay off informants who were sneaking around, local African Americans who could sneak around and get information for her. June 2nd, 1863, she led a raid along with Colonel James Montgomery up the Combahee River in South Carolina. There were 3 boats that steamed up the river, and her guides that she had relationships with helped them maneuver around the torpedoes in the river. And they successfully burned down several plantations and brought away 750 slaves from those plantations up the river. And at the time, it was written about in the newspaper that they credited this raid with to a black woman, and they called her the Black She-Moses. And there were some great articles written about her at the time. So there was acknowledgement even at the time of her great skill.
Was there a particular group that was responsible for naming the Tubman House on Mass Ave in South Bay?
I think that was established in 1903, and at the time there were several homes that were named in her honor, whether they were temperance facilities or homes for indigent or sick or disabled African Americans or for African American women. So it was in that time period that a lot of institutions were starting to name themselves after her. She had become prominent again in the 1890s because of her suffrage activism. She was back on the scene, so she was back in everybody's mind, and they started to honor her that way. Yes?
What happened to the black people when they cut north? Was there some process where they were getting housing?
There were vigilance committees that helped them get to Canada, but once they got to Canada, they were pretty much on their own to find jobs and support themselves. Later in the 1850s, because there was such a tremendous migration to Canada, American missionary societies started establishing programs in Canada to help support some of these refugees that were settling there with food and clothing and money, and some even bought land and divvied it up into farm parcels for them to grow their own food and things. Mm-hmm. During the 1850s, she did it through domestic work, laundry, cook, that kind of thing. Yes?
Was it risky for the people who wrote letters about her? How private would those have been, and didn't they kind of jeopardize?
Actually, for Northerners, it wasn't really risky because no one was looking at their mail. In the South, it was very, very risky. And William Still and Thomas Garrett, who corresponded back and forth, sometimes wrote in code so that if their letters were intercepted by the authorities, then they wouldn't figure out what they were talking about. But other letters, Thomas Garrett just would go on and on about Harriet Tubman and the latest, escape that she had made. And he used her stories to raise money. He wrote letters to women in Scotland, and they would read her latest story, and then they would send money to Thomas Garrett. So she was a great vehicle to raise funds through. Mm-hmm. She had no formal education, particularly as a slave. The education she received was through her father in the community that taught her how to read the stars and to manipulate this communication network and how to survive. Just to survive as a slave took a lot of, education in a sense. And when she came north, some people tried to teach her to read, but she never learned to read. But people would read. She liked to be read to, and apparently as she became more comfortable and didn't have to work so hard, she would be read to every day, so she would keep up on the latest politics. She loved to talk politics. So, and they write, and some of the abolitionists write about that, and they would, say, well, she believes this, and we should consider this. And so she was a genius. She really was.
This is Black History Month, based on the work that you've done, which is phenomenal.
Thank you.
What would you like us to learn, to take away from here, to celebrate as part of her spirit this month?
I think, for me, the big message about Harriet is that it's all about family and community, and that it isn't just her and her own efforts, that it wasn't just her courage. She couldn't have done any of that without a tremendous support network of black and white people. And I think that's the message that she would want. And that given the tremendous obstacles that she faced, none of us are going to have to face those obstacles, but she continued. She just kept going. And it was all about family and community and having a goal and never giving up. I have no idea that she did before the war, but apparently she knew Robert Gould Shaw during the war, and she supposedly fed him his last meal because she participated in that battle at Fort Wagner. And as a cook, she witnessed the battle, and there's this famous passage that she was quoted as describing the battle, and it's so lyrical. I can't repeat it now word for word, but it's in the book, and it just describes the metaphors of the rain was actually blood, and it was the dead bodies they reaped, not crops. And she just described this horrible, horrible event where the Massachusetts 54th was slaughtered. But so she said that she fed him his last meal, whether it was a dinner or breakfast, I don't recall. Stephen?
You came to your subject through reading a biography for children, biography of Harriet Tubman to your children. Are you planning now to write a biography for children?
No. No, because it would be as long as this. No, actually I consulted with Chelsea Clubhouse Books, which writes books for children, on a new biography of Harriet Tubman, and that just came out, I think, a couple months ago. So it has, like, what I believe to be the true story of Harriet Tubman in there as well. Mm-hmm.
In your remarks, you mentioned that Harriet had flaws. What were they?
While she was a great judge of character in general, I think she allowed people to take advantage of her, and she also was really bad with money. She just, people would give her money, and it would just, no one knew where it went. She didn't know where it went, and she would lose it, or people would steal it, and she also lied a lot. But that was a survival technique. But, she's just like everybody else. She told lies, and it was to suit her at the time. And she made bad judgments, just like everybody else. But that doesn't lessen her greatness. It's just, it makes her more real, I think. Mm-hmm.
Did the free blacks in the North have notarized papers where they had to carry with them at all times?
In the North, they didn't have to have free papers, but in the South, free blacks had to have papers that said that they were free. And actually, that was a great source of research for me in Dorchester County. Those records did not burn in the courthouse. So I was able to discern who was free and who wasn't. I could learn about John Tubman, her husband, who his parents were, what he looked like, because these freedom papers described the physical characteristics of free black people. So those records are actually available throughout the South for anyone looking to do African American research. And also manumission papers. A lot of slaves in the Upper South, not a lot, but some slaves were given freedom by their owners. And those were manumission papers that had to be recorded at the courthouse. And that's a great source of research material. Yes? There are quite a few, actually, and I've interviewed several of them. Actually, there's some that live right here in Boston. She had a nephew, Elijah Ross Stewart, who moved to Boston in the 1890s. He had married an African-American woman in Auburn, New York, and they had a couple of children in the late 1880s. Her name was Georgia. And they moved to Boston, and she died. And he married an Irish woman from Dublin, and they had 8 children. And they lived here in Boston, and he had, someone should write a book about him, his life being married to a white woman, living, none of them being accepted either in the black community or in the Irish community, and raising their children, and they became incredible musicians, and anyway, his story is pretty remarkable. But there are other relatives who live in New York, Canada, and probably there are still relatives that live in Maryland, because the brothers who ran away left children behind that they never could retrieve. So there are relatives living there as well. Mm-hmm.
Could you sketch out where Harriet Tubman lived in the North? Where did she call home?
In 1859, she bought the home from William Seward in Auburn, New York. When she traveled to Boston, let's say, before that, she would stay with the Haydens or John Rock or Frank Sanborn in Concord, and the other circle of his friends like the Emersons and the Alcotts. She would stay with them, and probably unidentified black families, particularly perhaps fugitive families that she knew from Maryland. She also stayed with other fugitives, refugees who were living in New Bedford. Several of the Dorchester County runaways settled in New Bedford, and she did spend time with them as well. Yes?
Could you say a little more about what it is about this story that really grabbed you?
Way back in the beginning, why the children's book, intrigued me. Well, because I had entered this women's history program, and I immediately became aware there were so many stories about women that have been lost to history, and here was a children's book about this great woman, and we knew so little. And I just felt there had to be more, and that's why I pursued it. Is that it?